So, you are one of the few authors I know that uses footnotes. What do you like about them?
Well, I mean, in the Nevernight series, the footnotes kind of did three jobs. The first, I guess, was compartmentalizing information, because I am a big fan of kind of traditional epic fantasy, like, doorstopper, thick epic fantasy books where they explain lots and lots of minute detail about the world. I like that kind of world building, but I appreciate that not everybody does. Some people are just forced into tears and they want to get to the action. So first of all, the footnotes were trying to compartmentalize that information. So if you are the kind of person who is interested about why the coinage of the realm is named what it is, or who this famous sword fighter was, or whatever, then you can read the footnotes and find out. But if you just want to follow Mia and her story, then you can skip them and you're not going to miss anything vital in terms of her story and, the tale that she is telling. So that was number one. Number two was to kind of offer moments of levity, to try and be funny, I guess. I tried to inject humor into the footnotes to give people a laugh, because ultimately Mia's story is a quite grim and dark and depressing one. And if I didn't try and inject humor into the story, it could kind of become relentlessly bleak. So I was trying to introduce a moment of lightness and laughter to what would otherwise be a pretty depressing story. Yeah. And third, the job, it's kind of a meta task as well, the footnotes are performing. You don't really find out the truth of that or the narrator until book 3, though. So it's kind of hard to talk about that element without spoiling things too much. Yeah. But yeah, basically 3 jobs. And, probably doing homage to Sir Terry Pratchett as well. I'm a big Pratchett fan. My wife is a big Pratchett fan, so he used footnotes. I can use them too. Why not?
Yes. My second question would be, which author do you think has influenced your writing the most?
There would probably be 2, well, 3 really. I mean, it's a cliched answer, but Tolkien. The Hobbit was the first fantasy book that I ever read, and that kind of opened a doorway up into science fiction and fantasy as a whole. The Hobbit was the first book where I really felt transported to another world. I still remember opening the first pages and seeing the map of Middle-earth and feeling like I had never felt reading a book before. So it's something of a cliche. He's kind of a time-honored answer to that question, but I have to give props to Tolkien just for opening that doorway. But was a big influence on me. I used to reread Neuromancer every year when I was kind of first learning, when I was first really trying to write a novel. I studied Gibson in particular. Like I really like the way his language is structured. I like the way his syntax and grammar and paragraph structures change to reflect the mood of what's happening in the text. Like he was the first writer I actually sat down and dissected as I was reading. And Stephen King as well is another big one. On Writing is probably my favorite writing advice kind of book. I tend to stray towards flamboyance and pretentiousness, I guess, in my writing. And Stephen King is a very kind of vanilla, up and down, say what you mean to say as economically as you can say it kind of writer. So he taught me, I guess, he taught me brevity, I guess, to be conscious of the fact that I tend to stray into flamboyance if I let myself. So I need to pull the reins in sometimes. So yeah, those are kind of the big 3.
Okay, thank you. So before writing, how much do you think about your tone and the word choices to fit the mood and the characters of the book you want to write? Or does that come natural?
No, it's probably a little bit of both. I try and think about the kind of book and story that I'm telling before I begin. Like the writing style I use in my YA work that I write with Amy Coffin, for example, is quite different to the tone that I use in my epic fantasy. So I try and use a tone and a structure and a grammar that kind of reflects the mood of the book that I'm writing. So the YA stuff tends to be more action adventure. I don't want to say lighthearted because those books can be pretty heavy as well, but I guess they're brighter in tone, in color palette, and the epic fantasy stuff I write is kind of more blacks and reds. So yeah, I think about it consciously when I'm starting, but I think also it's just a subconscious element that I'm influenced by as I'm writing. I tend to fall pretty easily into the world when I'm writing. I'm a very visual person, and I tend to see the scenes kind of playing out cinematically in my head, kind of like almost a movie, and I'm transcribing what I'm seeing on the film screen. And so that, because my brain is quite visual, the color palette of that scene is kind of reflective of the mood of the scene. So yeah, there's a subconscious element to it as well. But yeah, I'm more conscious probably when I'm working on my YA stuff that I need to bring things up. Not simplify it all, but just, yeah, I guess brighten the color palette.
Okay, thank you. So my next question would be, what do you like about using fantasy cliches, and when do you feel the urge of creating something new?
I mean, I try and do something new all the time. The great thing about, I guess, the tropes and cliche of fantasy is the audience, modern day audience, contemporary audience, is really quite literate in a lot of those cliches and tropes. So you can have a lot of fun subverting them. I guess that's because people are very familiar with kind of classic heroes' journey structures, and they're very familiar with, typical archetypal characters. You can subvert those constructs and surprise readers. You can lull them into a sense of security that they think they've had this story before. They think they know what this character is, and all of a sudden you can flip that on its head. So yeah, I think, but I mean, people talk about tropes like they're a bad thing. I don't necessarily agree with that at all. Tropes can be done badly. There's plenty of examples of bad writing out there, but you get a skilled writer. You can take the most time-honored and worn-out trope, and they can add something new and fresh to it. So, yeah, I don't think I would hesitate to say cliche. I would probably say trope. But there's a reason why we as humans kind of keep returning to these archetypal story structures over and over again. The theory is that there are only really 7 stories. Every story told is a variation of one of those 7 story structures. But there's a reason we keep going back to them, and that's because they speak truths to us. They speak to something subconscious or subliminal, something that resonates within almost every person. So yeah, I don't necessarily think they're a bad thing. I think they could be a lot of fun to play around with.
Yes, thank you. So I think your plot twists are very logical, but at the same time very unpredictable. How do you create them?
I usually start with them. I won't really be able to begin writing the book until I know what that flip is going to be. That's really when the book kind of comes alive in my mind. And usually when I'm thinking about a new project, I'm starting with that twist. So yeah, I'm not sure how I come up with them, but I guess the storytelling part of my brain is focused on that flip and reveal. And until I know it in my head, I don't really have a sense of what the project is. And I almost build backwards from that moment. So yeah, I don't know where they come from. I guess my mind is just kind of built that way, but it is a necessary part of the whole process. I can't really begin until I have an idea of what the third act twist is going to be and what the destination ultimately will be. I kind of liken it when I'm describing it to people. I liken it as I'm driving towards a city that's on the horizon. And because I'm not a very intensive plotter, I tend to kind of make things up as I go. But I have an idea of the destination in mind. So it's like I'm in a car and I'm driving towards a city. As long as I keep that city in my windshield, it doesn't matter whether I turn left or right or go through roundabouts or end up getting lost. As long as I'm driving towards the city, I will end up getting there. So yeah, the kind of last stop before the destination is that third act twist where everything kind of gets turned on its head. And I need that before I get into the car and start driving.
Yes. Interesting.
But I'm glad you like them. I'm glad you like them.
Yes, I really. How emotional do you get while writing? For example, when you meet someone.
Yeah, I can get really emotional. When I was finishing off Nevernight, I was kind of misty-eyed when I was finishing Dark Dawn. Sorry, as in completing the entire series, because it kind of felt like I was saying goodbye to, you know, old friends. These characters in this story I had lived with for kind of 4 years of my life, and it was a story that let me tour the world. And you know, Mia as a character means a lot to people, and some of the words that I've written have kind of resonated with people so much that, you know, they'll get them tattooed on their body for life. So there was a lot of weight, I guess, coming along with that series. So saying goodbye to it, I was really kind of sad. And the last page of Dark Dawn, where the narrator is kind of talking to the reader, that's almost me talking to the reader as well, kind of working through those feelings. But also in my new book, Empire of the Vampire, I was writing that up until probably about 3 weeks ago. I handed it into my editor, and kind of getting up to that third act twist when the horrible thing happens. I actually had to put the laptop down for 2 days. Like, I finished writing this scene and I was like, oh my God, that's probably the heaviest thing I've ever written in my life. I had to like close the screen and push the computer away and just walk away for like 2 days and not come back to the story, because it was just, yeah, it was one of the hardest things I've ever written, kind of emotionally, the impact of it all. So yeah, I do kind of get locked in. You know, every character that I write and every story that I tell is kind of coming from a place inside. So when horrible things happen to those characters, or when the story takes a really dark turn, I kind of feel it as well. It sounds a little bit strange maybe, but yeah, in some ways the characters are really quite real to me. So when they get hurt or when they die, it kind of feels like a part of me is getting hurt or dying as well. So.
Yes. Okay. Would you say that your writing has changed while creating the Nevernight Chronicle?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get better all the time. I'm trying to get more ambitious with every story that I tell. And Nevernight kind of grew in scope over the course of telling it. Trilogies tend to do that. They start in, you know, a first episode situation. By the time you get to episode 3, the scope of the story necessarily has to have expanded. So the world gets bigger and the story gets bigger. But yeah, definitely. I mean, Empire, the new book, you know, I worked on that for probably 2.5 years. And it's not a book that I could have written unless I had written Nevernight. You know, Nevernight was kind of a precursor to that in terms of storytelling craft and level of complexity and scope as well. So Empire isn't a book that I could have written 5 years ago. It's probably not a book that I could have written. It's definitely not a book that I could have written to begin with. So yeah, I think, I guess, hopefully my grasp of storytelling technique has improved and my craft of writing has improved, but also my ability to kind of tell bigger and more epic level fantasy tales has kind of improved just with practice. I guess it's like going to the gym or riding the bike. The more you do it, the better at it you're going to get. So yeah, Empire is definitely a book that I couldn't have written 5 years ago, and I couldn't have written it without writing Nevernight.
Thank you. So my next question is, I think you're really great at implementing topics that sometimes feel a little bit underrepresented in the genre of fantasy, like more dimensional, strong female or non-straight characters. How conscious do you do this, and how do you approach characters like this?
I don't know if I did it consciously to begin with. Mia began as a picture in my head of, you know, there's a cartoon character called Emily the Strange. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her. She's a little goth girl, you know. She's like a clothing icon, I guess. You would see her on T-shirts and backpacks and whatever. And visually, Mia began as an older version of Emily the Strange. That's where she started in my head. So she was always a female character. Even when I first wrote the first scene that she was in, she was always female. But the story that I wanted to tell her was kind of violent and brutal and bloody, and a story about revenge and the dangers thereof. So she had to be a naturally strong character by dint of the story that I wanted to tell. That wasn't something that I set out to do. It seemed to be the way she was pushing the story in my head. Like she felt pretty real to me when I first started writing her, which was a sign that I was kind of on to something. I could hear her voice quite clearly in my head. In terms of sexuality, that really didn't come into play until God's Grave in book 2. Like I laid the seeds for it in book 1, but because I'm not a plotter, I kind of fly by the seat of my pants a lot of the time. I wasn't sure if that was a thread that I was going to pick up. Like I kind of alluded to the fact that she was sort of attracted to Ashlyn, but that may never have gone anywhere. And it wasn't until readers started writing to me online, because I was still writing God's Grave when Nevernight got released, and I was seeing reader reactions to it, and a lot of people were asking me about that particular scene and about Mia's sexual orientation, and there was a lot of interest in the fact that maybe she was bi. But I had to put a lot of thought into it because, you know, the idea of a 40-year-old straight dude writing a bisexual teenage protagonist is fraught with peril. You could fuck that up pretty badly if you allowed yourself. So I was a little bit wary about jumping into it at first, but the readers were so enthusiastic about exploring that idea that kind of gave me the courage to do it. So again, that wasn't something that I went into consciously. It was part of reader reaction. It was part of the fandom's reaction. But I'm really glad that I worked up the courage to do that, because the relationship between her and Ashlyn, and subsequently her and Ashlyn Trick, is kind of the whole dynamic of the second and third book, particularly the third book. And I never would have found that dynamic had I not kind of taken that plunge. So, you know, I was respectful about it, and all of my beta readers on the book, I think all of my beta readers on the book were ladies, and 4 out of 5 were either gay or bi. So I kind of ran the story through the gamut of these very smart queer ladies, and they called me up on any of my bullshit. So I approached it respectfully. But yeah, I'm really glad that I did, because it ended up kind of being the core of Mia's story, particularly in book 3, the relationships that she has with the people around her. So, but yeah, I'm conscious of the fact that you can do a bad job if you let yourself. So I try and approach those topics with respect and care, but I'm really glad that I did.
Yes. So my last question is, who in the Nevernight Chronicle is the most like you, and which character is the least similar to you?
Mercurio is probably more of me in Mercurio than anyone else. Kind of the grumpy mentor figure. I have a soft spot for the grumpy mentor trope. And there's a lot of, particularly in the third book, there's a lot of me bleeding into him. In terms of the character that I am least like, I mean, it would probably be Skaver, the villain. Like, he is a man who pursues power for, well, he's not about power for power's sake, but he has a bloodiness and a vindictiveness that I can't relate to. I can't imagine being that kind of person. I understand why he does the things that he does, and he's sympathetic to me in that sense, but I'm just not wired that way. So yeah, probably the villain is least like me, but still there are parts of me in him. Like, there may be parts of me that I don't like, and he's a means by which to explore kind of a darker side of myself, and a darker side that probably exists in everybody. I think all good villains need to be sympathetic in that sense. You need to understand why he does the things that he does, but at the same time, I wouldn't do those things. So yeah, Skaver's probably least like me. There's a lot of me and Mia as well. She's kind of irreverent, and she doesn't really care what people think of her, and she's kind of brash, and she has a fuck you attitude that I kind of have as well. So there's a lot of me and Mia, but yeah, Mercurio is probably more me than anybody else.
Yes. Thank you very, very much for the interview.
You're welcome, my friend. Thanks for getting up so early for me.
Yeah, it was really fun and interesting. I hope you have a great day. And
you too.
Yes.
Thanks for reading. Thanks for spreading the word. Hope you have fun. Take care.
Yeah, thank you for writing really good books.
I'll keep trying to do so. Thanks for reading.
Okay. Have a good day.
See you, mate. Bye-bye.